Across the United States, African Americans have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the great news that we do have a vaccine that is now ready and has been deployed, we unfortunately have lingering questions and concerns among the African American community. The purpose of our Facebook Live event today is to hopefully address many of your questions and concerns so that we can provide great and accurate information to our community, disseminate it well so that we can increase uptake among those who, our community, our families who are most at risk for suffering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a pleasure to be able to interview Dr. Leroy Hicks. Thank you so much for joining me today. May you please start by introducing yourself and telling the viewers why you are so invested in ensuring that we're able to increase the vaccine uptake among our community and increasing accurate information that's out there. Thank you, Dr. Hicks.
Oh, certainly. Well, thank you first, Dr. Lee, for doing this session, and I appreciate those of you who are watching online as we stream this, and those of you who are trying to get the information, and perhaps many of you will act as individuals who can spread accurate information throughout the community. My current role, I am the Chief Medical Officer for Wilmington Hospital here at ChristianaCare, as well as the physician leader for our Value Institute, which is our research institute. And aside from being a doctor, a clinician who actively sees patients, manages processes, et cetera, I think it's really important that people understand I'm a member of the community. I live here in Wilmington, Delaware. I live in zip code 19802. I am myself the child of someone who died prematurely from cardiovascular disease, and that was the consequence of disparity in care. And what we see with COVID-19 is yet another example of how our community, the African American community, more specifically Black community here in the US, is at increased risk for death and negative consequences due to a myriad of factors. COVID-19 has brought many of these things to light. It is essential as a result that we provide clarity about what the vaccine is and isn't, and promote knowledge, real knowledge and accurate knowledge being disseminated in our community so that we're no longer disadvantaged.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Hicks, I must admit, when I first heard about Operation Warp Speed and about the vaccine, I was a bit skeptical and resistant at first. But once I saw the data and I felt very reassured that it was safe and effective after learning more about the vaccine. But I always like to disclose that with the history of mistrust and so much with clinical research, that I understand why people are distrustful. May you provide some more information about the vaccine development? Was it developed overnight, and why we should be confident that it is safe and effective?
Yeah, well, you know, political branding like warp speed certainly may give the impression that we're rapidly developing this and we're doing something that's novel. And we do know, and let's be very clear about this, that there is a clear history of testing, of research, of development of medical procedures that has been lacked transparency to communities of color, has taken advantage of communities of color, and the mistrust that many members of our community have for research, medical research, and for practice of medicine is really grounded in real evidence, and that these are things that have happened. That mistrust, frankly, is well-founded based on much of what's occurred historically. It's also important to note that this vaccine was not developed overnight. And so let's get into the facts to help people better understand why it seemingly came so fast. when you hear people talk about the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, which is what we're calling it, it is a new mutation, a new form of something that's been around for a long time, which is a group of viruses, a class of viruses called coronavirus. For those who are watching who are old enough, you may remember SARS from the early 2000s and MERS. The coronavirus COVID-19 actually has a lot of the same protein structures that existed in those cases. And much of the vaccine development, what really helped us jump this off so fast was that early work that was done 20 years ago in response to SARS found that there was a certain protein, which if you listen to the news, you hear something called a protein spike, that existed on these prior versions. And when we started developing vaccines 20 years ago to combat SARS, and those vaccine trials largely ended because of a lack of funding and a not internationally supported continuation of that work, we still benefited from the learnings of that vaccine development. That made it much easier to engage in developing a vaccine this time around because we already knew a lot about the targets. The second reason things seem to have occurred so quickly is the technology that's being used to develop this vaccine is new. It's new for vaccine development, but not new in medical research. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand. In the cancer world, as we've thought about targeted therapies to help people overcome certain cancers, they've been using this technology, something called mRNA, and we can talk a little bit more about that, to help develop therapeutics for some time. We've been able to actually use messenger RNA as a way now of giving code to your body about what the virus looks like. Because that technology was being utilized in other spaces and we had some background information on what this virus looks like because of what occurred 20 years ago, we were rapidly able to put together those technological advances and that prior information to develop a vaccine. The third thing that's important for people to know when they hear that this is unprecedented or this is the first time we've ever seen something like this where the vaccine was developed so quickly, it's also unprecedented the amount of international support that went into developing this vaccine, right? Countries and scientists all over the world pulled together, and countries and governments all over the world pulled together very early on to fund companies to develop this vaccine. Much different than I described about SARS 20 years ago, where trials began to run dry because of a lack of funding. Here, all the funding came up front. So 3 reasons that this advanced so quickly to keep in mind. 1, we already had some information about what the virus looks like, right? Because it's very similar to what occurred in the past. So that sped up the speed of getting the vaccine. Second, we had technology that was being used in other ways that enabled us to kind of leverage that technology very quickly in ways we hadn't before to develop a vaccine. And third, an international effort, both from governments and from pharmaceutical companies that had never occurred before. When you put those things together, it really makes sense that we're able to do this so quickly.
Excellent. Thank you for the additional information. Dr. Hicks, you mentioned mRNA and DNA. I was a chemistry major, and I'm not sure what your undergraduate major is, but there are a lot of people wondering, can this affect my DNA? We're introducing this into our body. Can it alter my DNA? Can you provide some more information about that? Yes.
So I can provide more information about that. Let me say off the top, the answer is no, right? So from a scientific standpoint, the exciting thing about this vaccine and why I want to be very clear, you cannot get coronavirus from the vaccine is because of really 2 factors. Forgetting the alphabet soup of letters that I used previously, know this. As we developed vaccines before, we would take parts of the actual virus, right, and give what's called an attenuated or weakened form of the virus to people for their immune system to rev up and fight against it. That's how the flu vaccine works, for instance. In this case, what we've done was taken something called messenger RNA, for those of you who remember, high school chemistry, which actually basically takes the genetic sequence of the virus and maps it out, and then we give that map to the individuals who are being vaccinated. So you produce just a little bit of the protein in your own body, so your immune system revs up to fight against it. You never get the virus injected into you, and you're not getting any messenger RNA to develop any other kind of viruses or any other kind of illnesses, just for the proteins for your antibodies to develop your own immune system, to rev up, and then you're able to fight the virus if you contract it. Does that answer the question, Dr. Lee?
It does. It does.
Oh.
Thank you very much. Along those lines, a lot of people say, okay, thank you, Dr. Hicks, for providing me with that additional information. But I'm still a little bit skeptical about vaccines and clinical research. Since Tuskegee, what measures have been put into place to ensure that this data is accurate and that we can have more confidence that it is safe and effective?
Yeah, important question. So I started off by saying there's a lot of reasons for there to be mistrust based on our history. I want to be very clear because we talk about Tuskegee a lot. Tuskegee is an example where people were enrolled in the study, Black men specifically, were enrolled in this study who had syphilis. And a couple of years after enrollment, we knew that penicillin would be an effective treatment, and penicillin was never offered to those participants so that the researchers could see all the terrible things that could happen if syphilis should continue, right? It was an abomination. It should not have happened. And it's an example of some of the things we talk about historically with experimentation among people from underserved communities. Now, there are a couple of things that have been put into place. In the United States of America, those of us who do research cannot perform clinical trials, cannot do research without a couple of safeguards. One, we have to, as we're writing the protocols and getting funding, we have to report the number of people who are going to be in our studies by race and ethnicity and by gender to make sure that people become aware of who is and is not in the trial. Two, we have to assure that we're putting safeguards into place about your private data, the private data of people that are being enrolled in clinical trials. Three, every clinical trial is reviewed by a group of individuals, which is called a safety and monitoring board, to which anyone who conducts a study has to report their data, side effects, consequences, and how those things differ by the characteristics of participants. In other words, the Black people who are in the study, the Latinx people who are in the study, women and men, if it's reporting a fever, if it's reporting a cough. And it has to, in clinical trials, be reported to this data safety and monitoring board, boards that didn't exist and weren't required at the time of Tuskegee, to assure that a trial can even continue forward. We've placed a lot of safeguards into the clinical trials world to assure that people are stopping trials early when they think harm may be put into place, and also put a lot of information, a lot of safeguards into place to make sure that we're adequately including populations from diverse backgrounds. Is that the answer that you were looking for?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned a few side effects and how the CDC has the monitoring process even now for the COVID-19 vaccine. We tell people that the study's not over. They're continuously evaluating our patients and individuals even after the vaccine. Can you discuss some of those processes as well as what are some of the common side effects that people can anticipate?
Yeah, so certainly. It might be worth, if you don't mind, let me tell you who was in the trials first, just so everyone is on the same page. So important to know, there are lots of pharmaceutical companies who have, going back into last spring, been working on COVID vaccines. Here in the US, because of these safeguards that are put into place, our Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, has said that you have to meet a certain standard of proof that the vaccine is effective and low risk before we'll allow you, your company, to be authorized for use here in the US. So as a result of the many, like Sophie Adventis and other sort of manufacturers who are out there, many of their trials have yet to meet the threshold of the FDA, and so they're not approved yet. Again, protecting those of us to make sure that the data are actually strong. As a result, there are only 2 approved vaccines. Many of you have heard the term Moderna, and you've heard the term Pfizer, because those companies, of the many, have met the US standard so far for emergency authorization. So we're not, as my father would say, willy-nilly accepting vaccines from any company, right? We're being very, very stringent about who met that threshold. Okay, so in the studies that were done, we know a few things. One, they were limited to adult populations. I believe the youngest age of participants was 17, I believe, for the Pfizer trial. So no young children were included. They also excluded women who were actively pregnant. They did not exclude women who were perhaps trying to get pregnant, or women who had been pregnant, or even women who were breastfeeding. They excluded women who were pregnant. So as a result, we don't recommend giving the vaccine to people who weren't studied. And currently, the World Health Organization is not recommending vaccination for women who are actively pregnant, and they're not recommending vaccination for little children. Instead, what's being recommended, to your point, Dr. Lee, about ongoing trials, is start doing trials in that population so that we can be assured that it's safe and effective. That means, because I've gotten a lot of questions about this, that the vaccine has been tested, and we can talk about the side effects, I'll do that in a moment. And we've seen side effects and the profile for adults, okay, 18 and up, perhaps as low as 17 for the Pfizer vaccine. It is thought to be safe for lactating mothers who have children, because there's no belief that when you develop the protein from the mRNA that that's going to pass to your child. But we don't know enough about how the vaccine works in women who are actively pregnant or in children, so we're not recommending it for them. Most people who get the vaccine do not get a side effect when you look at the trials, but there are some side effects that are more common than others, and the side effects actually are more prevalent. You have more side effects and slightly more significant side effects with the second shot than you do with the first. So when I got my vaccine, I've been vaccinated. I was one of the people that got the most frequent complications with the first shot, which is soreness at the site, right? Most people, again, fewer than half report any side effects. But those that do with the first shot, the majority report what I felt like, which was someone punched me in my arm at the site, and I had that for about a day and a half, 2 days, right? The next most common complaint is a fever, headache, and some people complain of chills and muscle aches. The typical length of that is about a day to a day and a half in the studies. In these 2 large sort of manufacturer studies that were done in phases 2 and 3, there were only 2 people that had quite significant, like, respiratory distress from having received the vaccine. In both of those, neither individual died, and both of those individuals had a documented history of having very severe allergic reactions to the vaccine before. So it's very, very unlikely that you'll have an emergency level response to this, unlike with COVID-19, right, where the death rate is very high. With the vaccine, it's very unlikely that most people will get a side effect at all. That very severe side effect of the hundreds and hundreds of people that were tried only occurred in 2 people who have those kind of bad reactions when they have vaccines in the past. With the second dose of the vaccine, people tend to report more nausea, which is what I had for about 6 hours after I had it. a low-grade fever between 101 and 103, muscle aches and fatigue. And for me, there was no fever. I was fatigued for about a day and a half, and I had nausea for about 6 hours the day of the vaccination, the second time.
I had those similar symptoms, Dr. Hicks. So I just want to let everyone know to anticipate these side effects, especially after the first vaccine, so that we don't catch them off guard, so that they can go and get the second one, and let them know that these are symptoms that hopefully will improve within a couple of days, if not hours, but that is safe, and these are expected symptoms and are actually a sign that your immune system is working.
That's right.
Yes.
Right.
All right.
One more thing about the people who were allowed in the trial and the recommendations, because again, I want to be very clear. No children were in the trials, and as is very, very common when we do these trials, we don't include certain populations. First, we want to make sure it's safe in everyone else, and that's the reason, I suspect pregnant women weren't included. Although the WHO isn't recommending that we give the dose to them, what they are recommending is they talk to their obstetrician. So I just want to make that very clear. If you have young children and you're concerned about them being vaccinated, or you're a pregnant woman, you really should be talking to your doctor to weigh the pros and cons, right? Particularly if you have other chronic diseases that place you at risk. There is some data that suggests that if you are pregnant and you contract the actual disease, COVID-19, it may be associated with premature delivery. So it's really, really important to talk to your obstetrician if you're thinking about the vaccine.
Excellent. Thank you for that, because I know that some healthcare providers who are pregnant have received the vaccine, but that's a discussion that we encourage everyone to have with their physician. And so we have a question from the audience. I'm so glad that our viewers are submitting questions. So they were wondering, are there any populations that should be excluded from the vaccine? And you touched on that, but for cancer patients, do we recommend, or who are currently in treatment, do we recommend the vaccine to them? And if so, are there any other populations of concern that we should address as well?
So the nice thing about the studies that were done, and it's important, there were more than 150 test sites done across multiple countries. So not inclusive of only the US, but South Africa. There were sites in Asia and throughout Europe, as well as I believe Brazil, both in the Pfizer and Moderna trials. And they included people with a wide range of comorbidities, including cancer. And when they did the subgroup, when they broke down their analysis to look at how effective this was based on how you looked or the kind of diseases that you had, they found that it was more than 95% effective with these doses of vaccine, when you get both, with these types of vaccine, at preventing you from getting sick if you got coronavirus. So we know it's effective in patients who have cancer. What I would encourage you to do, because we are appropriately concerned when you're receiving therapy that may suppress your immune system or something like that, about receiving anything exogenous, even if it's just messenger protein, again, make sure you talk to your doctor. Currently, the recommendation would be from the WHO that it's safe to administer these drugs to patients who are receiving therapy. But, as I said with pregnant women, yes, I would highly encourage you to speak with your oncologist in this case about receiving the vaccination. The other population we haven't touched on is people who have already had COVID-19. And the thoughts are, and they actually studied this, is that you can develop further immunity from the vaccine if you have had COVID. And so unless you've recently received antibodies as part of your treatment for COVID, it's probably a good thing to get. But the rollout of the vaccine is in such short supply, we really want to focus on people who haven't been exposed first. And so we're going to, really target people who are older, people who are in essential services, who place themselves at risk because, for work, they have to be exposed to people long periods of time, and then expanding vaccine doses to people who are at higher risk of mortality. That's what we're aiming to do up front. And then we'll get to people who have been, exposed to COVID as a formal recommendation down the line.
Excellent. Along those lines, people who have been exposed to COVID, do you know if there's like a minimum time period? If they had it 6 months ago, versus 2 weeks ago that they should wait between receiving the vaccine?
I'm not completely clear on the timeline. So initially, the recommendation was to wait for 90 days after having active COVID infection. There is some suggestion now that in the absence of symptoms and having completed your course of the disease, that it's now safe to get the vaccine. However, I've not yet seen the formal recommendations for when exactly to administer it after COVID infection.
Excellent. Thank you. We have another question from the audience, and I want to thank Nicole for our first question. This question is from Jabari. Like the flu vaccine, do we know if we'll have to receive the COVID vaccine every year?
It's a great question. So we don't. I can tell you what I suspect and what I'm hearing throughout the community. As you may know, that we already are seeing variants, slight mutations in the virus, right? Right now, we've documented worldwide that in addition to the COVID-19 that we experienced in the spring, there are now 4 variants populating around the world. 2 of those variants we know right now are here in the United States. It looks like the current vaccines that are approved by Moderna and Pfizer remain effective to at least 3 of those, and the 4th one is under study, and people believe it will be highly, highly effective against that as well. So that's great news. The answer to your question, Jabari, and I apologize if I got your name wrong, is whether or not we'll continue to have variations developing from COVID-19. Every year, you have to get the flu vaccine because the influenza virus, the virus that causes the flu, actually differs year to year. And so you have to rev up your immune system to the particular proteins from the new virus. And that may well be the case with coronavirus. The good news is because of the technology I mentioned, kind of giving you the code, that mRNA technology, it makes it really easy for us to very quickly, once we've isolated a new strain, develop a vaccine from it. So that process will go along much more smoothly than it has traditionally with the flu every year.
Excellent. We received another question. We talked about cancer patients. Have you heard if hypothyroidism is a contraindication, having hypothyroidism to the vaccine?
I have not heard that.
Audience. Okay.
I have not heard that that's a contraindication. Excellent. And again, please, as a provider, I would encourage you, as opposed to saying, I'm not going to get the vaccine because I'm worried, I would prefer you say, I'm going to call my doctor and ask them if I should get the vaccine. I think that's really, really important.
Excellent. Next question. After both of us have received our vaccine and we have to wear masks at our job, but many of the people in the community are wondering, once I'm fully vaccinated, do I have to continue to wear my mask?
So, I'm going to say 2 words that both begin with V, and I want people to, if you can see my hands, pay close attention. Right now, what we're facing as a country is a balance that has to be achieved between getting the vaccine out, that's the first V, compared to spreading around the variants of the coronavirus that are developing, right? If these new variants get passed along from individual to individual, which happens by not wearing masks, not appropriately socially distancing, being in highly populated areas, all the things that we know have allowed coronavirus to spread up to this date. If that outpaces our rate of vaccination, we're going to continue to be in trouble, right? So wearing masks, whether you've been vaccinated or not, is really, really important to contain the spread, not only of the COVID-19 that was most prevalent in our community up through now, but also variants. I would recommend after, as do all the authorities, after you get the vaccine, you continue to wear a mask. Keep in mind that the vaccine is very, very effective at keeping you from getting sick. We know that, right? But your vaccination doesn't prevent someone else from catching the virus if you happen to be carrying the virus yourself. You won't get sick from it, right? Worst case scenario, maybe you'll feel mild symptoms. But your 80-year-old grandmother, if she's yet to be vaccinated, might very well get the virus. right? So still please wear a mask, still please wash your hands, keep your hands out of your nose and mouth so that you're not getting a virus on your hands and passing it to someone else. Wear a mask and physically distance until we see the rates of the spread in the community really tamp down much lower. Once that happens, then we'll return to some semblance of normality, and people can take the masks off, and we can get back to what's closer to a normal life, a life that existed before. That community spread has got to go much lower, though.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. Stephanie has a very good question. All the questions have been good so far, but this is a question that I've been receiving almost every day. I'm scheduled to take the vaccine coming up. Should I take some Benadryl, Tylenol, or Motrin prior to receiving the vaccine? What do you think, Dr. Hicks?
Yeah, I don't know that it matters. I will tell you, again, that you can treat yourself for the symptoms after you get the vaccine. Again, most people, the majority of people really do not, based on all the data, have side effects, right? But a reasonable number of them do. And so for the arm soreness, I took Tylenol. I do think, however, if you have a history of reactions to prior vaccines, and you know that treatment has helped with antihistamines like Benadryl for those things, then it might be worthwhile doing. It is definitely worthwhile if you have a history of severe reactions to vaccines, which is rare. But for those of you who know that you definitely want to have your EpiPen if you should get the vaccine. And again, talk to your doctor about getting the vaccine and making sure that your EpiPen or other therapies are up to date.
Thank you for that, because I've heard a few people even say that they're not going to get the vaccine because they're concerned about their history of allergies. So thank you for that. My next question is about, we're worried about getting the vaccine. We're providing education.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
Yes.
I want those people to also understand and think what happens if you get COVID-19. Yes. Right? Yes. We are underselling how effective this vaccine is in preventing you from getting sick from COVID-19, but always think about the alternative. If you contract COVID-19, and millions of people have, and over 400,000 Americans have died from it, okay, what is the risk to you, particularly if you have high-risk conditions, whether you have allergies or not? Okay, I'm sorry, Marshall. Please continue.
No, thank you. We're doing our best to make sure that we can provide testing as well as vaccines to all communities. And many people are concerned about cost. Do you know the vaccine has a cost and if it's free to people?
So we have made it available to people without them having to pay. And in fact, the federal government has put a lot of effort into making sure that both testing and vaccines are available to people without having a financial burden. And so I think it's really important for people when they have access through these state-funded sites and through the private entities that will be working with the government, to not be concerned about co-pays, because you should be receiving the vaccine at no cost to you. This is a massive public health effort to be able to establish enough people in this country who are immune so that the disease dies out in terms of its spread in the community.
Excellent. I've also heard that some people are concerned that have high blood pressure and diabetes. Have you heard of any worsening symptoms in those populations, like where they have higher glucose or higher blood pressure because of the vaccine?
No, and if their blood sugar is higher, as someone who has many diabetics in their family after they get the shot, it's largely because of what they ate the night before or their adherence to their medication. I can say that because, I have diabetics in my family, right? Here's the truth. The vaccine, again, as we mentioned, is different than it has been in the past, where we're not actually giving you a weakened dose of the virus, right? We're giving you your body a code, so that your body can rev up its own immune system. I do think it's important, again, to recognize that you should be monitoring your blood pressure at home if you're hypertensive anyway. And you should, and whether or not you have a cuff available to you is something we want to make sure that you discuss with your doctor. You should absolutely be checking your blood sugar if you're diabetic routinely at home in any case. And you should absolutely do it, surrounding having the vaccine as you would on a routine basis. Important to note that both of those conditions increase your risk of death if you contract COVID-19. So we really want our diabetics and our high blood pressure patients to get the vaccine because of the risk of mortality if you get the virus.
Excellent. Dr. Hicks, I just received a signal that we have to wrap up soon, but you know, I really want to come back as many times as we can. Prior to me wrapping up, do you have any additional comments that you want to share with the group?
I'm glad people are asking questions. I thank you, Dr. Lee, and those who put together this session. I think it's really, really important that we get the facts out to our community. I will say this, and I'll speak specifically to members of Latinx and Black communities and those who are from communities that have traditionally been underserved and undertreated by healthcare organizations. We're at a unique juncture where while yes, those of us from those communities continue to be at higher risk for death, 25% or so of cases of COVID-19 in Delaware have occurred among people who are self-described as Black. That's a highly prevalent disease, and our risk of getting it in this state has been higher. For the Latinx community, much higher. We've yet to receive the vaccination in equal rates. And I think it's critically important to think about how devastating this disease is in our communities, and to know, once you know the evidence and the facts, that we have a highly effective way of reducing the likelihood of getting ill, potentially the likelihood of spreading it in these same communities that are disproportionately suffering. I really want to focus on our efforts to get people of color to vaccine centers, get the needle in your arm, get the vaccine. It's protecting not only yourself from being sick, it's keeping the hospitals from being overfilled, to submit you love, have better access to healthcare, and it will help establish a lower amount of virus in our communities so the people that you love won't get sick. And anything we can do here at ChristianaCare to support providing you information about the vaccine, we're happy to do it. Please reach out to your providers, reach out to Dr. Lee or myself. We will make ourselves available to answer your questions. And I thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much for joining me for this conversation, Dr. Hicks. I really appreciate you, and I know our viewers appreciate you. I also want to thank each and every one of our viewers for being here. We really are depending on you to help share the word and share information to our community. Please go to www.ChristianaCare.org for additional information about the vaccine and COVID-19. You can also email questions to culture@ChristianaCare.org. We want additional information about what your questions are and what additional resources that we can share to the community. And we also promise that we will be back for additional conversations. Dr. Hicks, I may need to lean upon you for your expertise in future conversations. And so I just thank you for your time today. I thank our viewers for their time today. Be safe, and we look forward to partnering with you, ChristianaCare, in your health. And we want you to know that we are invested in your safety and health. So thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.